Hello, Jeff Minear with Shiloh Baptist Church of Bowie, Maryland, covering a 5 devotional series on the biblical view of death and grieving, equipping people, whether you've trusted Christ as your Savior yet or not, equipping people on how to grieve well, whether it's the little bumps in the road that leave us sad for a few hours, the bump that leaves us just off kilter for a week, the bump that I have to come up with a job and I don't know how to help my family and I'm spinning for 6 months, the loss of a loved one, a child, and I'm not all together in 2 years. I'm convinced that the better we grieve on the little things, the less we have to worry about what would happen if I lost my wife. It'll be devastating. But I know what it is to grieve, and I know what it is to cling to God who holds tomorrow. And I know since He's got me through so many things, He can get me through the absolute worst. I just have to lean on Him and grieve and go with it. So, first devotional, we talked about a biblical view of death. If you haven't seen it, please go back and watch it. Second, we talked about the initial phase, the crisis phase, where you've just been informed you've lost your job. You've just been informed somebody has died, up until the funeral where you can actually let go. That was crisis. Now let's talk about the crucible phase. And with each of these phases, there's what to expect lengthwise, what to expect me to go through as I'm grieving, what I must do at each phase when I'm grieving, and then what in the world do the rest of us do who want to be a help? And we're sitting there unsure. The crucible phase. We've had the funeral, and this can now go on. Maybe they died on Tuesday and we have the funeral the next Tuesday. Crisis phase may have been a week. So now I'm going on, and very often the crucible phase is a good 12 weeks. It's going to be a good 3 months, 90 days, and we're in this crucible phase, and there's special things that just the way a human is wired, we're going to experience and go through, have to work through. So what can I expect lengthwise? 12 weeks or more, first 6 weeks, the most intense, most troublesome. What am I going to be going through? This is where a discussion of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's steps of grieving come to play. Good thing about observational psychology, they merely do a good track record of what human beings experience. So I never want you to think that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's steps of grieving is what you ought to experience. Anyone who says that's not dealing with the data accurately. Rather, as I would like to present it to you, as you face each of these things, know that it's perfectly typical for a human to do so, and your goal is to get through it and not stay there spinning on this one thing. So as Elizabeth Kubler-Ross watched hundreds of people dying and recorded what they went through and tabulated her study, she found that many of them started with denial, moved to anger, moved to bargaining, moved to depression, and ended with acceptance. What would denial mean, that first one? When it comes out, your son has just died. Not my son! That is a statement of denial. It's not evil, it's not wrong, it's what? It is an attempt for the mind to start grasping something that shatters us, it blows us away. No, not me, not her. It can be anywhere from a loss of reality, they're just talking nonsense for a few hours, to where it's just a fleeting thought. How could my Uncle Paul die? I just talked to him. We just had this experience. The first thing that will often hit us is denial. If you notice it, keep right on moving. The second thing is anger or resentment or bitterness. That moves from, no, not me, to, why? Me? It can be directed at a loving family member. It can be directed at God. It can be directed at self. Anger itself is not sin. It's what you do with it. And when you use it to destroy and attack yourself or attack others, it's sinful anger. Many of us will go through anger. My mother's father died of cancer. And she turned to me one day trying to process her own grieving. And she said, I feel so stupid. I'm angry at my own dad for dying of cancer. It's one of the normal steps and things we have to process and get through. One of the saddest things to watch as a pastor and a friend is when a couple divorces and there's children in the family. And what has been saddest is when it happens that one of the partners left to aggressively pursue somebody else and left the children and the other parent high and dry. They bailed. Now, that's the reality that has happened. And what makes it so sad is when the children trying to function with their grieving are angry at the parent who's stable. They're angry and yelling and screaming at the parent who's still here when they're actually angry at the one who left. When in grieving, anger doesn't make sense. And we have to give great grace to those who are grieving for the angry or silly or stupid things that come out of our mouths while we're grieving. You can expect denial. You can expect anger. You can expect bargaining. The denial, no, not me. The anger, why me? Bargaining, yes, me, but. What I went through in this bargaining realm, maybe you have too, when Deb had her car accident, was the if only loop. She was in a car accident. If the other car had just slowed down, no brain injury, no accident, no coma. If Deborah had waited and had seen the car not pulled out in front of him. If only the car had hit on its brakes. Deborah came across a road that was curving. The car was coming down the hill. If she had just hit her brakes, she didn't hit Deb until Deb had gone all the way across the road. And the skid marks didn't start until the lady had pulled totally into Deborah's lane and was about to hit her, and then she actually hit her brakes. You could see the skid marks were only 30 feet long. There were so many if-onlys, this accident would never have happened. And you need to catch yourself, what I'm doing, and let it go. A very similar thing happens when we remember the last words I spoke to them were, and we beat ourselves. If only I'd said, I love you the last time I saw you. Catch the fact that you're looping. Let it go. So we'll have denial, anger, bargaining, depression. And I'm not just talking about those 2 or 3 days where I'm off kilter and I'm struggling to get up emotionally. When we see that somebody is grieving enough that the dishes aren't washed, they're not bathing, they're not brushing their teeth, they haven't mown a lawn in a month, life isn't going on, we're talking about a clinical depression that's something serious. And we need to be ready to be a help. Sometimes it's a courageous acceptance of the loss and grief, and they're so overwhelmed they can't function. Sometimes there's an exhaustion from extreme mental anguish. They may try and escape at this point of depression. My family had family friends who would come and spend the holidays with us. We had one family friend who would take so many sleeping pills, she would basically sleep from Christmas Eve day through that day, Christmas Day, and the day after, because the relationship with her children was so broken. She just wanted to sleep and ignore Christmas happening. That's a depression as well as a denial. What we who are grieving, hurting must do, we must weaken and break the ties, the emotional ties for the future bound up with the one or the thing lost. If you and I were, and we wouldn't realize we're necessarily emotionally attached to our job, but if you like your job, you're invested in what you're doing, you're emotionally attached. We had that crisis period, you're fired, clean out your desk, you're going. So you're struggling. So now you're in that crucible. And especially if you find yourself on the what ifs. What was said that I got fired? And you've got to let go. I've lost my job. I have got to cut the emotional ties with the future income, my 401k, the job security, and all that meant for my family and all my planning. You've got to cut the emotional ties with that so that you can let go and you can find something else to start investing in, which is our next devotional. We must weaken and break those emotional ties. We must accept God's forgiveness and forgive ourselves. Let it go. We must work through all of those what ifs. Work through it and let it go. It's a typical thing to wrestle with this for a few weeks. That's why I said you can expect this to be 12 weeks, with the first 6 the most intense. Our goal, to cut as many of those emotional strings toward the future as possible, to free myself to start rebuilding life. How do the rest of us who are watching, who want to be a support and encouragement, how do we help? I want to encourage you to be there regularly, touching base as you see fit, once a day, once a week, for 6 weeks minimum, and then decrease it little by little, but stay in touch. Feel free to, if COVID would let you, take them out to eat, get them out of the house, spend some time with them. One of the things Deb and I learned was the goal of making sure we don't make the grieving person beg. We love to magnanimously walk up and say, now June, with the loss of Frank, if you and the kids need anything, you just ask. And we sound so magnanimous, and it's unhelpful. I don't beg well when things are going great. I guarantee I don't beg well when I'm grieving. So what do? I want to offer help. Visit enough that you see where help happens, where help is needed. Be one of those precious, quiet people that as others have come in to support and help the grieving loved one, you just go over and do the dishes. You quietly gather the clothes in the bedroom and you do the laundry. You land with your lawnmower and you mow the lawn. Don't make them beg for help. Bring a meal and do something to be a help. Encourage expression through writing or talking when they're ready. Encourage good reading materials. As the fog lifts enough, they can start trying to process, where am I? Who else has gone through this so that I might be able to be encouraged? I want to encourage you in something that didn't come up in the notes yet, whether it was the crisis, the first high pressure period, or this crucible, those first 90 days. There's plenty of pressure still the first 3 months. In our American culture, we're always struggling with, well, I don't know what to say. The old American phrase, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth so we'd listen twice as much as we talk. When you go to be with someone who's grieving, face that demand that there's silence in the room and I'm uncomfortable and I've got to say something, and clamp it down. You do not have to talk. You do not have to quote scripture at them. You do not, please do not be glib and try to comfort as though the loss is nothing of a big deal. Well, we know John's in heaven. Isn't that great? It's not a comfort. It's not a help. And it hurts desperately when we're flippant or come across as flippant. When my wife was lying in a coma from this car accident, the grandparents and the aunts and uncles are from Indiana, many of them farmers. And they did the greatest gift imaginable by just coming into the waiting room at the hospital and sitting there quietly with us. They were comfortable with silence, and it gave Deb's mom and I an opportunity to try to process this crisis period and try to process anything that medical staff were saying about Deb's condition. It's okay. It is helpful to be there and be silent. Many have said for years and years and years, looking at the book of Job in the Bible, his 3 friends were the best friends the 3 weeks they kept their mouths shut. When they opened their mouths, they just dug a hole and tried to throw Job in. So when you don't know what to say, it's okay to be quiet. In these 90 days, as they're starting to try to function and then through the construction phase, I want to encourage you to change an American pattern. We so flippantly say, "How you doing?" as we walk past not expecting an answer. Rather than asking questions of grieving people, make statements. "It's good to see you." It ends up meaning the same thing, but it is a positive statement that doesn't ask for a response you don't want. My wife learned to give an answer that her conscience could live with. When people would see her at church after the brain injury, and this is now 6 months going on to a year after the accident, but Deb is all broken up, trying to rebuild life from a brain injury, from the half-side paralysis, everything going on. "Hey, Deb, how you doing?" She tried to answer honestly a few times, and the people, they were just horrified. She would actually talk back, and they didn't want that. So don't ask questions to a grieving person. When they thoughtlessly did say, "Hey, how you doing?" Doing okay physically. Now, still all broken up, but it was the emotional part of her life that was still all a turmoil and where the heartache was. And if all they wanted to hear was, "I'm doing fine physically," everyone was happy. Those who actually cared would swing back a few minutes later when, of time appropriate, they would say, "So, I heard you say you're doing physically fine. How can I pray for you for the rest of stuff that's not fine?" And that showed who really wanted to know, who appropriately asked when, if you break down crying because you're grieving, you're not embarrassed. And they really wanted to be there to support. So we're around. We want to be supportive. Make statements. We don't say, "If you need anything," we don't make them beg. We just help. And say, "I've been praying for you. It is so good to see you up and about. I've missed you terribly." Make positive, encouraging statements. Don't ask questions unless you've got the time and it's appropriate to hear the answer and appropriate for them to break down as they're still working through the trials. So this is the crucible phase. Please check back in for the next 2. Thank you for being with me.